Good afternoon, friends and newcomers to the South Orange Library Lecture Series. Thank you all for coming today. We have a great program planned with two of my favorite speakers, Lisa and Jason Jordan. Lisa was kind enough to speak once, and I said, do you know any wonderful speakers also? And she said, well, my husband. And I called him up, and I said, okay, you're recruited. Lisa's Director of Environmental Studies and Sustainability Program at Drew, and Jason is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Drew University. Lisa, you first spoke here on March 2nd, 2017 on the topic Food Security and International Health, and on December 14th of the year, the effects of weather. You not only donated your time and talent, but thank you for donating him too. Jason first spoke here on March 9th, 2017 on the topic American Inequality, Past, Present, and Future. And then on March 8th of 2018 on the topic The Resurgence of Populist Nationalism in the West from Trump to the National Front. I asked if they could both come and speak at the same time. Of course not at the same time as I said, but one will speak and then the other will speak. And we'll learn so much, and unfortunately there is so much inequality that, and they have the facts to prove it. Not fake facts, true facts. And so thank you so much for coming and donating your time here. Before I begin, I always thank all of my fellow friends and librarians for all of their help and support for these programs. I couldn't do it without them. And now, please, let's give a very warm welcome to our very special guests, Lisa and Jason Jordan.
Well, thank you for having us again. And I guess we didn't wear out our welcome. And anytime there's a microphone, I'll show up. You know, that's all it takes. So Lisa and I study a lot of different subjects. She's a geographer and studies public health, and I study political science. And we research and study a lot of topics. But one place of shared interest is the topic of inequality. And my principal interest in inequality is overall levels of income inequality in the United States and other European societies. And there's a lot of ways of thinking about and measuring income inequality, but one way is to think about the differences in what proportion of the income is controlled by different groups. And so this is a graph of income inequality. It's from 2016. The data is from 2016. And so what we have here is the share of income that is gained by each group in that year. And so the bottom 50%, so the poorest 50% of people in the country earn about 13% of the total income of everybody in the country. And then you can see the next sort of 40%, so from 50% to 90%, they control about 40% of the income. And then when we move into the top 10%, you can see the next 9%, right? So from 90% to 99, they get about 27%. And then when you get to the top of the pile, the top 1% that we were always hearing about, the top 1% earns about 20% of all the income in a given year. And that's what income inequality looks like today. But when you look at a graph like this, I mean, what should it be, right? It's not necessarily clear that this is it good, is it bad, in the sense that, well, what proportion of the income should the 1% control, right? Should it only have 1%? Should it have 50%? Should it have, so it's hard, just a single graph to tell you, is this good or is it bad, or what does it really mean? And so the way to sort of think about what this means is to think about how it looks in comparison both to how the United States has looked historically and also how it looks in comparison to other countries. So the first step is to look at, well, what did income inequality look like in previous periods? And so if we compare income inequality today to income inequality in 1970, this is what it looks like. So the blue bar is what income inequality looked like in 1970. And so you can see for the bottom 50%, the bottom 50% in 1970 earned about 21% of income. Middle income earns about 45%, and really it's the top and the bottom that are the most interesting, and the top 1% controlled about 11% of all the income in the world. And so when you sort of look at them together, the most sort of impressive thing that has happened is that the bottom 50% has seen its share of the income drop by almost half, and the top 1% have seen their share of the income double. Now, it's important to remember that everybody's income is increasing, right? This is the share of the income. But the distribution has definitely shifted, and the principal shift that has occurred is a shift from the bottom 50% to the top 1%. And you can see the differences in the middle are also there, but they're much, much smaller. The principal change that has occurred in the United States in the last 40 years is a significant increase in the share of income that is going to the top 1%. And that has had a really fundamental effect on how the United States compares to other countries. In the 1950s and 60s, when people studied the United States, one of the things that they talked about is that the United States was sort of fundamentally equal in a way that was surprising in comparison to other countries. So we look at the United States in comparison to other countries. We can do that in 1971 here, and 2013 here, the last time we have data for enough countries to pay attention to. And again, this is now the income share of the top 1%. So in each country, in Australia here in 1971, the top 1% controlled about 6% of income in 1971. And you can see that in here, the United States is relatively high in 1971, but it's not abnormally so. Right? I mean, we were beating Germany. We're right around what Switzerland and France are, not substantially different. So the top 1% again is around 13%. And so the United States is sort of in the pack. But when we go to 2013, you can see that the ordering changes quite considerably. And the United States goes from being high, but sort of in the range of other countries, to being really quite abnormally high. And so the United States has become a country that was sort of normal, a little high, to being very abnormally high in comparison to other countries. So the inequality in the United States now is substantially greater than it is across any other Western democratic society. And that's new. It wasn't historically that way. And another way of thinking about that is that the change in inequality in the United States is substantially greater than the change in any other country, that the amount of movement towards inequality is substantially higher in the United States than it is in other countries. Another way of sort of looking at that is if we can look at it a little more fine-grained. I like pictures. I'm very childish that way. But this is the graph of the share of the income of the top 1% in the United States from 1915 to 2013. I'm sorry, it ends in 2014. And you can see that a couple of things. And the first is, back in the 1950s and in the 1920s here, you can see that the top 1% owned about 20% of income. Right? And then what happens is you have a little economic crisis that comes back. This is the Great Depression. So the Great Depression ended up destroying quite a bit of wealth of the top 1% because the only people in the stock market were the top 1%. So that was resulted in a really dramatic and quick decline, which recovered very quickly. And then this is World War II. So World War II also did a lot to destroy incomes and also spread incomes out more broadly across society. And then you can see that from the end of World War II into the 1970s, really into 1980, that income inequality was declining. And this is just one measure, but across all income inequality measures, what you see is that income inequality steadily declined from the beginning of World War II into the 1980s. And so by 1980, the top 1% owned, again, about 13% of income, which would have been in the realm of normal, again, for other Western societies. And just about every Western society, this part looks exactly the same. Like the level is different, but the pattern is exactly the same. If we were to look at Australia, the line would be smaller, but it would be the same basic shape. And that's true of Germany and every other society. But then something happened, right? So there's this very clear moment in 1980, where you can see the beginning in 1980 into the present, that income inequality has risen really steadily. There's a few bumps along the road. There's a few little economic crises that sort of, caused the thing to go down. Here's the Great Recession, right? And you can see the Great Recession ended for the wealthy almost immediately. And so there's a very consistent increase in income inequality, so that today, sort of we have returned to levels of income inequality that we saw in 1915, right? And it continues to grow. And so the question is, why is that happening, right? So why is income inequality growing so consistently and so rapidly, and why did it start to happen in the 1980s? And the good thing is, when I teach this to students who are 18, they have no idea, right? Like the 1980 is like some point, and then there were dinosaurs, they didn't know. And most of you, I think, probably have some sense of what was going on in 1980. But that's the election of Ronald Reagan. And you can see from the beginning of the election of Ronald Reagan into the present, we see this consistent increase in income inequality. So the question is, what's making that happen? And this is actually a really big and complicated debate in political science and in economics. Why is income inequality rising so rapidly? And there are a very large number of sources that are debated, and many of them that you hear about in the media. The most important that we talk about a lot are two things. One is technology, right? That we have manufacturing technology, robotics has consistently improved, and this has made it harder and harder to do manufacturing work. And then with the introduction of Amazon and online, we see that service sector jobs, right, working in retail, is also declining. And so one of the arguments is that as technology increases, it's harder and harder for poor people to find good work. And not just poor people, but middle class, working class families as well. And the second argument is that it's about free trade, and this, of course, is a part of our politics, that free trade has meant that manufacturing jobs have been shipped overseas, and this has produced, reduced the number of manufacturing jobs that are in the United States. And both of those arguments have a lot of weight to them, and I think they're both important for us to think about. But one of the problems for that story in explaining American inequality is that all of those things are happening in Europe too, right? So in Europe, they have technology too. They found it, and I don't know who let it out of the bag, but they discovered the internet and robots. And Europe is more embedded in the free trade world than is the United States economy, right? They're in the European Union, where they have opened themselves up completely to free trade with other European societies, and then effectively with the rest of the world. And so in those societies too, we see increases in income inequality. Almost every society has had some increase in income inequality, but the increases we see in Europe are not nearly the same size as that of the United States. They're much, much smaller. In some countries, it's almost imperceptible. In places like Norway and Denmark, inequality has increased just a very, very tiny amount. And so if it was technology and trade, what we would expect is technology and trade is hitting all these societies the same. We would see the same pattern across all of them, but we don't see that. And so if that's true, then the question is, what makes the United States different from those other societies, right? So if Denmark is going along and its income inequality isn't increasing substantially, and the United States is, and both of them are globalized and both of them have technology, what's the difference? The difference is that the United States, over the last 40 to 50 years, has adopted a number of policies, economic policies, that have substantially helped those wealthy individuals build wealth. So beginning in the 1980s, we changed a lot of economic policies, a lot of tax policies, in ways that contributed to the rich building larger and larger chunks of wealth. And that wealth then produces increasing income, which creates a spiraling upward. Which is to say, another way of thinking about this is that prior to the 1980s, there were a lot of policies in place which took income from the rich and then redistributed it across society, and that the taking of the income from the rich has, over time, consistently declined. And there's a number of policies in which that occurred, right? So a number of policy changes that occurred. So the first of those policies, of course, is really obvious, is the reduction in tax rates. And so from the 1980s to the present, we've consistently cut taxes. And the cutting of taxes has actually, it's often common to say, well, we're only cutting taxes on the rich, which is sort of true, but also misses the point that actually what's happened is that from the 1980s to the present, we've cut taxes so much that about half the population doesn't pay income taxes at all. So now if you cut taxes, the only people you can cut taxes on is the rich, because they're the only ones paying income taxes. But what you can see is that this is the one way of looking at what has changed. This is the top marginal tax rate in the United States from 1913 to 2018. So 1913 was the first income tax. And what the top marginal rate is the rate paid for the richest people on the dollar they're making at that point. So for example, when you're here at 80%, it doesn't mean that if you're rich, you pay 80% of your income in taxes. What it means is that every dollar you make, if you're a billionaire, every dollar you make, in addition, is going to be taxed at 80%. Right? So the top marginal tax rate sort of kicks in once you reach a certain level of wealth, and it's on each additional dollar past that. Right? And you can see that this is World War II. Right? So this is World War I. So we financed World War I by taxing rich people at incredibly high rates. Then World War I ended, and we brought it back down. And then World War II started, and we jacked it back up to pay for the war. And then you can see after World War II, it stayed very high for a long period of time. And then it was brought down a little bit. But then you can see that, again, in 1980, the top marginal tax rate fell considerably. So that the taxing of very wealthy individuals was slashed by a substantial amount. So in 1980, it fell all the way down into less than 30%, and now it's increased a little bit. This is the Bush tax cuts, and then they kind of come back. But that's the Trump tax cuts. And so you can see that the taxing of the mega rich has declined really quite considerable. So the tax take of the very wealthy has declined considerably. There are other changes to tax policy which have a similar effect. This is what it looks like from 1970 to the present. And this is important because this was just in the news that, I can't remember her name, from New York, was just proposing to increase the top marginal tax rate to 70%. And people said, well, that's crazy. But that's what we were doing in the 1980s, right? So it's not, maybe that was crazy, maybe that's bad policy, but it's not like she's from the moon, right? Like we were doing that in our lifetimes. But the other thing that we did is we made some other changes to the tax code. For example, we have substantially slashed the estate tax. And so the estate tax effectively didn't exist until 1915, and then you can see this is the percentage of the average percentage paid by the estate tax. And you can see that from the 1940s, by the end of World War II, into 1980, the estate tax was really considerably high. And the important thing about the estate tax to understand is that the estate tax is paid by very few people. Of all the people who die in a given year, it's about 2% of the population actually pay the estate tax. And the current, what's the word I want? Exclusion is $12 million. So the first so if you die with less than $12 million, the inheritance tax doesn't touch you at all, right? And then after that is when the estate tax kicks in. And you can see that back in the 1980s, we had a very high estate tax, and the effect of that was when you passed away, you did not pass away a huge portion of your fortune onto your children, at least in the form of cash, right? You could in real estate and other things, but and you can see that over time that the inheritance tax has been reduced considerably, and it's reduced in two ways. The graph only shows one, which is the rate has been cut by more than half, and then in addition, the exclusion gets bigger and bigger every year, by way more than inflation. So the taxing of the super wealthy upon death has declined considerably in the last 40 years. So those tax policies, I'm going to tease you. Let's look at the next one. The next thing is that in the last 40 years, we have changed the way that we tax income. In the 1980s, capital gains taxes, so investment income and wage income, were taxed exactly the same thing. Money is money. It doesn't matter where you get it. But beginning in the 1980s, we started taxing capital gains or investment income at a different rate than we did wages. And we have continuously reduced the capital gains tax so that investment income now is more profitable than wage income. And you can see, it's very hard to sort of calculate the rate, but you can see that over time, this is, the green number here is the total amount of capital gains in a given year for the country as a whole, and you can see that it's just skyrocketed. So this green line going up, what this is a sign of is the amount of investment income that's coming into the United States, that's being made by Americans, I should say. And you can see that the amount of investment income being made by Americans is skyrocketing. So an increasingly large portion of the incomes of the wealthy come from investment income. And that rate of growth has been really incredible. And you can see the capital gains rate, this is the capital gains sort of amount of tax paid, has also increased. And in one sense, it's increased a lot, because it's now like $100 billion, and it used to be, a couple of million. So it's increased a lot. But the rate of change is nowhere near, right? So what this means then is, what this is sort of showing is that an increasingly large portion of the wealthy's income comes not from wages, but from investment, and that investment is taxed at a lower rate than wages. And so as the rich have shifted increasingly to investment income, they are also taking a very substantial tax advantage from that. If you put all these things together, what this means is that people, the wealthy, are allowed to pile up larger and larger and larger chunks of money, right? And so the wealth of the wealthy is becoming larger and larger and larger because it's not being taxed away in the way that it was in the 1980s. And again, I'm not talking about some like socialist paradise that, we professors, we're pinko communists, of course. And I'm talking about the United States in 1980, right? And so this is a substantially changed taxation environment. And I'm probably like running all over your time. And she's happy to hear me talk. She loves to hear me talk. It's the centerpiece of our relationship.
Well, the first slide you showed was wage income or income?
Income.
Okay.
All, yeah. I mean, yeah.
No, it's not the same.
What's that?
No.
No, it isn't the same thing. So, because it is the same thing when you're spending it, right? But it's not the same thing when it's being taxed, right? So the other thing that has changed is that the United States has adopted a bunch of changes to the tax code and to social policy more generally in ways that help the wealthy to build income. And this has been going on for quite some time. And I am running out of time, so I am sensitive to your time. So what's the quick way of saying this? Is sort of two things have been happening since, this has really been going on for about 30 to about 50 years really, is that the United States has built a welfare state, the welfare state that you know. The welfare state that most of us know, when we say welfare, what most of us think about is, food stamps, TANF, what used to be AFDC, and public housing, things like that. But there's this other welfare state that most of us don't know about. And the other welfare state that we don't know about is a whole system of tax subsidies and direct subsidies for the provision of social goods to everybody in theory. And these include things that we might not think of that way. So for example, the mortgage interest rate deduction. Right? So most of us have hopefully gotten the mortgage interest rate deduction, and that feels like, okay, that's a nice thing that I get. But the mortgage interest rate deduction, if you think about it, is a housing subsidy. You bought a house, the government's then giving you money back for buying your house. So it is subsidizing the purchase of your house. And the thing about the mortgage interest rate deduction is if you buy a small house, you don't really get it, right? Because it's typically smaller than the sort of standard deduction. So the bigger your house is, the bigger the deduction is. And so the richer you are and the bigger the place you purchase, the more benefit you're going to get out of it. And there's actually a host of tax cuts that are this way. So for example, paying for college, same thing. The more you pay for college, the bigger the tax benefits you get from college, and so the bigger the cut is. And so this is a federal subsidy for people to go to college, and it goes more to the people in the middle and upper classes than it does to the poor. And there are a host of these policies that are happening where the United States tax code is designed to provide tax benefits, which we don't perceive as welfare, but are effectively subsidies to the wealthy and the middle classes. Additionally, there are other policies which are really hard to quantify, but in which the United States has done things to subsidize other kinds of activities. And again, housing. So for example, Freddie and Fannie, you guys have heard of it, right? They underwrite home loans. And when they underwrite home loans, what the federal government has effectively done, this is an exaggeration for those on YouTube, but it has effectively written a guarantee of home loans which makes banks loan money to at larger quantities and at lower rates than they otherwise would. But the people who benefit most from that are middle and upper income people because they get cheap loans. And poor people don't tend to get those benefits, right? So this is a huge housing benefit worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year that go to the middle and upper income families that no one sees and no one thinks of as a welfare state. But over the years, what has happened is those programs have grown in size because they're popular and effectively invisible, and the programs that are designed for poor people are unpopular and very visible, and so they have been progressively cut. And one way of thinking about what that means is I took the total housing benefit, so this is, what I'm about to show you is all the money the federal government spent in 2016 on housing, okay? And when I say that, what you're gonna imagine is like building, what do they call it? You know.
Public housing?
Public housing, yes. So that's what you're gonna think of. You're gonna think public housing, right? So subsidies for public housing and, I can't think of the name of them. But I want you also to consider the other kinds of benefits. And if you do that, this is the distribution of, well, so first is, this is the distribution of the mortgage interest rate deduction. So this is the billions of dollars going to different income groups. And you can see the people on the bottom, they get nothing. If they could afford a house worth mortgage interest rate deduction, they wouldn't be in that group. But people at very high incomes are taking billions of dollars from the federal government to support their buying of houses. So if you take that, and then what I'm gonna do is add in sort of public housing for the poor, right? And that's what it looks like. So this is the total amount of money that the United States spends in a year to support housing in the United States. And you can see that the public housing portion, it's not that it's tiny, I mean, it's billions of dollars. But when you add in the subsidies to housing, most of America's income support or housing support goes to the super wealthy. And this is because we have a tax policy where we have a social policy where we support things through the tax code, and only the super rich can take advantage of those benefits. And so, in effect, we have a hidden welfare state, which works to the benefit of the middle class, and in particular the upper class. And then we have a public welfare state, which is very meager and often open for cuts. Ironically, to pay for the tax cuts that are given to the rich, right? In the form, right? So we have to cut public housing because we gave all the public housing money away to the rich. The effect of all of these policies together, these policy changes since the 1980s, has been to allow those at the top of the income pile to accumulate increasingly large shares of wealth. And as they accumulate increasingly large shares of wealth in the form of investment income, that investment income then builds and produces increasing wealth over time. And the policies that we used to have in place, which would have limited the capacity to do that, have largely been taken away. And it's important for us to understand that that is what is happening. It's also important for us to understand that when people talk about alternatives to that, maybe you like those alternatives, maybe you don't. That's a political choice, and all of us can disagree about that. But it is important for us to remember that this is not, we're not talking about maybe we should shift to be, the Soviet Union. What we're talking about is maybe we should go back to policies that we had 40 to 50 years ago. Right? And maybe that's a good idea, maybe it's not a bad idea, but it's not as if we're talking about, wandering around on Mars or some kind of crazy philosophical position. So that's what I have to say, and so I'm gonna now put you in much more capable hands.
I just want to ask one question. It didn't matter which party was involved, right? Republican and Democrat have been changing the rules, have been following the newer rules.
Yeah, I mean, to put it very, it's a complex story, right? So to answer you quickly, the answer is that the Republicans cut taxes and the Democrats tend to hold spending in line. I mean, that is a gross exaggeration, but generally speaking, that is what has happened. And we can think about, when the Republicans come into power, they cut taxes. When the Democrats come into power, they remake welfare as we know it, right? Yeah. And so the effect is that under Republicans, inequality tends to increase dramatically. Under Democrats, it doesn't. It still increases, but not at the same rate, right? Broadly speaking, yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much. This is a short time. No one even knew what tax cuts what it really meant.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Phyllis, for having us. Jason and I met in college. We were on the debate team together. And this is the first time since we were on college and the debate team where we've gotten to present together. So thank you for this opportunity. It's a treat. So I'm a geographer, he's a political scientist, and there is a geography to inequality as well. This first chart I have shows in the United States the ratio of average top 1% of income earners to the average bottom 99% of income earners. So you can see highlighted here for New York, Florida, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Nevada. In some of these states, the ratio between the top 1% of earners is over 30%, or over 30, so 30 times the average income of the top 1% in these states that are in darker colors than the bottom 99% average incomes. But when I was thinking about talking about inequality, what comes to mind is a geographic inequality that I've spent my career studying, and that is inequalities in wealth and inequalities in health. When I was a graduate student at University of Colorado, I was really struck by this map of health inequality in the United States. This shows the age-adjusted death rates by state. This report is from the CDC in 2017. So what an age-adjusted death rate means is if we created an age distribution for each state that was equivalent to the national average, how would death rates between states compare? And what we see here is these are in deaths per 100,000 age-adjusted population, and they range significantly from 585 to 957. That's deaths per 100,000 people. And so we see in the South and along the Mississippi Delta, death rates that are nearly twice the average as they are in other parts of the US. And what has struck me is not just this map alone, but the continued mapping of a whole variety of diseases, other age-adjusted death rates over different years, and a number of other variables that follow this very similar pattern. And they describe a really fundamental inequity in the United States that we've known about, but I've only come to really internalize after seeing 20 years of these kind of maps. If you map poverty, for example, in the US, it's not entirely different. As Andrew Spielman, who is a public health expert at Harvard, used to say, health is wealth and wealth is health. And so we've known that these associations exist. This shows percent of the population in poverty in the US from the American Community Survey, their 2013 to 2017 latest statistics. And they range from 8% of the population in each state to 21.5%. So again, this Mississippi Delta appears, and these inequalities in the US are a factor of our history. And it's not terribly unrelated to the motivations for the cuts that we heard Jason talk about, the public welfare cuts and why they occur. So there's certainly a historical, a racialized aspect of inequalities in our health, in our wealth, and in the income distributions we see today. So what I thought would be interesting to talk about is my work recently to explore the concept of environmental justice. It's been an important topic of our environmental studies program at Drew, and has been amplified by the work of Reverend William Barber, who is a Drew alum, and has worked to reconstruct the Poor People's Campaign that Martin Luther King Jr. Advocated for before he was assassinated. And one dimension of William Barber's work that was important is to look at the inequalities in environmental issues in the United States. Here it talks about his touring with Al Gore, going around before election day, drawing attention to environmental issues. As he argues, lower income communities, especially Black, Hispanic, and Native American ones, tend to be more polluted and bear more of the burden of climate change than higher income and white communities. So this has brought attention to this concept of environmental justice. And if it's a new word for you, I have the EPA definition of what environmental justice is. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Fair treatment means that no group of people, including racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic groups, should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, municipal, and commercial operations, or the execution of federal, state, local, and tribal programs and policies. And I love that that's a part of EPA regulation. The attention to environmental justice has really been heightened by the work of the scholar Robert Bullard. And he was working in the 70s, early 80s in Houston, and exploring the distribution of incinerators and toxic waste sites. And he discovered disproportionately the incinerators were in Black communities. And all the public incinerators in Houston were in majority Black communities. And yet there was very little Black representation in government. And so he sought to highlight this concern. One of the outcomes of his work, along with the work of others, was a report commissioned by the United Church of Christ called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. This was the first time researchers assembled a United States-wide database of toxic waste facilities. And what is shown on the map of the cover of the report are counties where the Black and Hispanic percentage of population is greater than their national percentages, and where there was the presence of toxic waste facilities. And so I called out New Jersey too, because we have some inequities in the distribution of toxic waste as well. One of the recommendations of this committee was to urge the President of the United States to issue an executive order mandating federal agencies to consider the impact of current policies and regulations on racial and ethnic communities. I read this report when I was in college. I loved this document. It was really well written, great data. And what was so exciting for me was to see a report that led to action. So it was really this report that was instrumental in the executive order under Clinton, federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. In graduate school, I did research. I was at the University of Colorado then, and now I'm in New Jersey, but I was very interested in studying New Jersey, and I looked at the distribution of environmental toxics through the toxics release inventory. These are facilities in New Jersey that produce hazardous materials, particularly ones that produce persistent bioaccumulative toxics. And alongside this report came the 20-year update from the Toxic Waste and Race report, which was also really influential in our field to explore inequities in environmental health. And this report found that for percent of people of color living within 1 kilometer of a toxic waste site, the proportions were so much higher. And then the further, these are distances, so blue is 1 kilometer, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, and it was about 47% of the population within 1 kilometer of these sites were people of color. So there was this inequity in exposure. When I came to Drew, I worked with the EPA. They had a neat program called the Toxic Release Inventory Challenge. And I worked with Nora Lopez, who is our Region 2 Toxics Release Inventory Coordinator. So we did some research with the students to look at changes in toxic industries in New Jersey. And these are 1990, 2000, and 2010 facilities that report toxics. And there's a similar distributional pattern over the last 30 years, but we found a huge decline. This is corresponding with a large deindustrialization in New Jersey. So from 1990 to 2000 to 2010, the number of toxic release industries dropped from 787 to 269. And the number of total toxics releases in pounds was reduced from 1990 of 30.3 million to 5.7 million in 2010. So there's been a huge decrease in the amount of environmental pollutants, but we also saw an increase in the unequal share of burden or proximity to those pollutants. So when we looked at the demographic measures, the majority of the populations living nearby toxic release sites are white, but they're disproportionate compared to Hispanic, Black, and Native American populations, where there's been an increase over the years in proximity to those sites. So mixed information, generally declining exposure to these toxics, also this increasing burden of exposure to what exists. So this is an important topic today in the arena of public health. I went to the public health conferences in San Diego a few months ago, and there were big signs all over the conference area advertising the Building Healthy Communities program and some major initiatives that the state of California is taking to reduce inequities in health. The mantra of this is it's your zip code, not your genetic code, and the discussion of how much environment influences human health. And so in this, it's showing different zip codes with different life expectancies, a gap of 10 years. So there's been a lot of interest locally in exploring concerns about environmental justice, but also tying environmental justice issues into concerns about changes in the climate. This is a picture of a wonderful sixth grader who was presenting at the climate rally in Morristown. She would give us a really rousing speech, and it was really stimulating. My kids were very much inspired by her work. Here's my son with his Climate Jobs and Justice poster. So what we did with my classes this semester is to look more closely at the relationship between climate change and anticipating how climate change might influence inequality in the future. So to kind of look at trajectories, other ways and other factors that influence inequities. So when I came last time, I talked about the weather, and we were talking about Harvey, Irma, Maria, and the impact of these major storms. And I spoke about the work of Gilbert White, who said floods are acts of God, but flood losses are largely acts of man. And the work from Bill Moseley, who argued, we often think of hazards as exogenous events or acts of God, but their destructive or harmful nature frequently has as much or more to do with the structure of society as with the natural environment. So putting these together, income inequality and policy. Last year we talked about Harvey and the impacts to disproportionate impacts on low-income populations, the increase in evictions following major hurricane events, the inequities in recovery after storm events from lack of ownership of housing, resources, or even cars, and increasing evidence that's finding quantitative evidence of the rise in inequities that result from natural disasters. This continued this year as we did our work looking at the impacts of North Carolina, where the poorest bore the brunt of flooding. William Barber's own mother was flooded, and he talked about that on his environmental justice tour, an equal distribution of the catastrophe in North Carolina. And this report in the Houston Chronicle that was an editorial reflecting on forgetting after the hurricane passes. And she wrote about life is back to normal, which is to say that the same challenges hang over us, quiet and pervasive as a cloud, the escalating impact of climate change, the persistence of racial injustice, rampant individualism, the assault of unbridled capitalism on family and community, and our seeming inability to grasp the ground beneath our feet is nowhere as near as solid as it seems. true in Florida as well, where Michael hit the parts of Florida least prepared to flee, and Paradise, California, and the impacts of forest fires being unequally distributed. So one of the texts I talked about last time was The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, where the author concludes that the struggles of activism in Black Lives Matter are linked to the struggles of activism in 350.org, which is linked to the struggles of activism in certain parts of the slow food movement. And this is my favorite slide that I'll finish with. But in asking my students after a semester of coursework in environmental justice, what did you learn? Tell me what you think you see here. One of their initial findings was these issues are connected. The issues of social justice are linked, that eviction crisis, environmental issues, and natural disasters, income inequality, that these are related struggles. And they also recognize that working on these issues require being in it for the long haul. We watched a film by Robert Bullard called Marathon for Justice, where he takes a really positive look but recognizes that the issues we face are quite big and require a long-term commitment to working on. However, there is some urgency to these issues, especially with natural disasters and climate change, that responses are needed. Vulnerable populations may have low resilience, and it's important to recognize the difficulties they face. Factors contributing to inequalities emerged from the systems that create them, and solutions also need to be systematic. Environmental justice issues, and like Jason concluded with, income inequality issues, especially embedded in our tax code, may be difficult to see, more embedded in our system. So it's good to bring these to light to discuss. And similarly, environmental hazards also can be veiled. We often don't know about them, the lead in our water or the risks to flooding. So I was happy to see these were some of the conclusions our younger generations were arriving at. And so I thought we'd end there, and Jason and I are open for questions. Phyllis.
Would you did a study in New Jersey. Would you name the towns that you think, like Newark or Patterson, or would you have said the 4 areas?
Right. Oh, so well, yes. Newark, Trenton, Camden, Patterson. Some of these areas are designated specifically as zones of concern for environmental injustice, so they are already recognized and observed and studied by the EPA. In the 2006 study that I did that I showed, that's what we found, is that association was stronger in those communities. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to ask, was there any study made on the industrial impact of the social impact in the Appalachian area before they voted to cut out all the coal mines and so forth? I mean, was there a study made of what's going to happen to the people who work in the mines? Were they just thrown aside, or was there consideration given?
This is a good question. It's a topic that one of my colleagues works on. There's a lot of mining that continues in Appalachia, mountaintop removal practice. Every year we have a alternative spring break program. Students from Drew go to Appalachia and are involved in a lot of different community activities. They work in a soup kitchen, they go to public health offices and talk about addiction, and they go to the sites of mountaintop removal, which is still practiced. Some of that has to do a little bit with the forms of mining that have changed. Mountaintop removal is a very mechanically intensive process. It's less labor than in the past. But my overall answer is yes, there are studies that explore not just the environmental impacts on people, but the community impacts of deindustrialization and changes in dramatic changes that happen with that change in economy. So though I am not an expert on that, I know there's studies on it, and that transformation is painful, and it needs to be accompanied with job retraining and serious other forms to facilitate transformation and not leave people high and dry if there is a big shift. A lot of attention for environmental justice has come last year in the form of looking at lead in the water in Flint, Michigan. And Flint, Michigan is another site of deindustrialization of the automotive industry. And there's a lot of work there as well. And in the public health meetings, there was exploration of looking at the Flint water crisis through the lens of industrial transformation and not just in the shift of water supply itself and what it led to, but what it means for the state of Michigan to de-invest in those areas that had once had all the support from Ford and GM and the other companies. So I think that there is concern about that. You're right. There's, with all the environmental hazards, there's the economic benefits, and that transformation needs to come with both changes.
Yeah, but you show the, oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that whenever you come back here again, you both have to come. Because it was perfect.
She said we both need to come back next time. Come together.
I agree. Is, the dramatic reduction you were talking about, way down, is that removal of toxic waste dumps? Is that modification? Is it changes in the law?
All of those. Also, the toxics release inventory is active industry that must record their number and volume of emissions. So if there are fewer toxics release inventory slips being filled, that means there's fewer industries open that are producing those. So it's a major industrial production decline.
And the employment.
Which we can trust. The data set is from the EPA, it's from the Community Planning and Right to Know Act. It's industries over 15 people. So there was a big explosion in West Texas, I think 2 years ago, which was a small plant that was under 15 people. So you can still have an industry that is active pollutant that's not on the list. But overall, that decline, that trend in the decline is continuing and is also, I think, really reflecting that loss of industry.
Jason, have you done similar studies at a state level in terms of state activity that's beneficial to one income group over another? For example, I'm thinking of support for transportation, mass transit and things of that nature.
Yeah, so the question is, have I studied state policy, state level policies that affect income inequality? And the very unsatisfying but true answer is no. My main area of research is on differences across countries. And actually, I'm kind of not even allowed to talk about the US, but you won't tell anybody. So no, I haven't looked at policies like support for transportation and things like that. I mean, there are differences in tax policy across states, support for education, and you can see, and what Lisa showed in the maps, that there are really dramatic differences across states in the level of income inequality. What is sort of strange in that map is that some of the really high levels of income inequality are also the places of very high levels of wealth, right? Like New York City and Massachusetts. And so it might not be the places that you think that had the highest levels of income inequality, because they're sort of, that's where the places where a lot of those policies are in place, like Massachusetts and New York, are also the places where the super wealthy are. So it's a little bit more complicated at a state level, and I haven't done much research on that at all.
I was surprised that California was not in your list of the high income sites.
It is high, though.
Yeah, it's not that it's not high income, but it's the ratio of the highest to the average income is what it is.
Yeah, it's
right.
The 1% to the 99. And California it is over 30. So it's right.
Yeah, so it's really that New York is so high that it sort of skews the map to where it looks like it's only New York. But yeah, California and Washington is also quite high, right? Washington and Oregon. Yeah, so the places where income is growing fastest and is highest is where the levels of income inequality are highest.
Does politics play an important part in the next election? Will things
No.
change?
No.
He's not allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, no, you won't tell. I mean, yeah, politics. That's part of what I'm saying is when we talk about income inequality, it is often treated as sort of this inevitable economic forces that you can't do anything about, right? So it's technology, and you can't really do anything about that. And it's globalization, and you can try to do things. You can try to cut yourself off from the global economy, but it doesn't work. It just hurts your economy. We live in a globalized world. So if you don't, if you say we're not going to free trade with everyone else, all that happens is the companies don't stay. They just go places where they, well, fine, we'll move to Mexico and Canada where they do free trade. So it doesn't really help you in the long run. But the thing is that the research sort of shows that those things matter, but the more substantial thing that we see is there's huge variations across countries, but there aren't huge variations across countries in the levels of technology and trade in the Western world. And so the lion's share of the difference is how do countries tax the rich, and how do they redistribute those taxes across the rest? And that is the lion's share of the changes that we see in inequality. So it is all political, right? And the sort of argument that it is, it's all these economic forces is largely a sort of scientific argument about whether that's true or not, but it's a political argument, right? There's nothing that can be done about this. It's not our fault, right? It's this invisible hand of globalization, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's just false, right? It's not true. Now, a question about whether anything's going to be done about it is really a very different question, right? Lisa's like, oh no, he's going to go into this, but I'm going to keep it short because this is a long tirade. But the short version is that the Democratic Party hasn't really been talking about inequality for about 40 years. There's a variety of reasons for that, but if you think about what the Democratic Party is today, it is a collection of poor people, minority groups, right? That's one part of it, and it is also college-educated, high-income individuals, and they do not agree with one another on what should be done about income inequality. And so the Democratic Party has not, for many elections, really talked about income inequality. If you think about Barack Obama, you could probably think of some times that he talked about income inequality, but if you really sort of look at the sort of corpus of his work and his discussion, there's very little discussion of income inequality, and that's purposeful. The Democratic Party has started talking about income inequality, but it is treated as sort of a marginal issue, right? Well, you're a populist, you're an extreme left-winger, and again, the strangeness of that is that a lot of the policies that are being proposed are policies that were in place, right? We did those things. Now, maybe they're not good policies, but again, they're not crazy. Like these are things within the realm of normal for the United States. So whether income inequality will be a significant part of the Democratic pitch, I don't know. I mean, right now it's been relatively marginal but growing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for your wife. It must be at least 20 years ago that the debate in Essex County over the incinerator down near the airport, and the fight as to what it was going to do to the east ward of Newark. And I don't know whether it's gotten any better or how it's there.
It's there.
And it's spewing.
Yeah, there's air pollutants as a result.
Yeah.
And those pollutants are monitored. And I was at a conference at the New School last spring that was still very much against the incinerator and advocating against the production of new incinerators. There were also some really interesting presentations and discussion of the flows of waste and New York and New Jersey's relationship as part of this waste stream. So it's an issue of concern, but it's one that there's frustration but not much ability to resist it since it's in construction and it's in operation. Yeah, so that's one of many environmental issues of concern that is ongoing. And there are new ones emerging as well. Have you heard about the Meadowlands power plant and concerns about inequities there? There's been a lot of new and emerging research about asthma rates in Newark, and the triggers for that are multiple. So the air pollutants from incinerators are one, air pollutants from diesel and other increased traffic. And there's a lot of really good research now on triggers within homes in housing. So that's something that's continuing to be an important part of the debate. I think focusing on childhood asthma, there's been a lot of success there in trying to move health programs to move forward to find solutions that are not just individual health-based, but community-based health.
What was the Meadowlands? I didn't.
There's a proposed power plant to be constructed in the Meadowlands. The interesting thing about that plant is it would be for energy for New York and not energy for New Jersey. So there's some frustration as well as its construction in the Meadowlands. So there's...
What about the conflict with the mall over there, with that giant mall that's going to be built?
Yeah, I don't know about them all. Yeah. Right.
So that's gonna be built in the marshlands, which they find the wetlands.
Right, the Meadowlands, right. Yeah.
Wasn't sure.
Yeah. Oh.
Thank you so much.